but I'd like to welcome the panelists. I'd like to uh, thank you for sharing your time and your expertise with the participants of the conference to talk about innovations and learning. Uh, just to get started, excuse me, I'm going to go over some short bios for the panelists. First, we have Christopher Lind. He's a HR digital first leader who's never been in HR. He's a big fan of HR technology and how it's changing human behavior. He's a husband to an incredible wife and a father to 5 incredible children. Next, we have Trish Ewell. She's a technologist and learning leader. Trish advises on digital learning technology and digital learning strategy in the age of data analytics and intelligent machines. She's the creator of the Learning Systems Engineering Framework and founder of the Talent and Learning Analytics Leadership Forum. Diana will be with us shortly, but we also have Anila. And Anila is a curious lifelong learner with a desire to help bring out the potential in others and invite people to bring their best self to work in life. So welcome, everyone. I just thought maybe we could go around the room in sort of the same order. And to get started, maybe you'd like to talk about what you're doing in the space right now, and maybe we could focus on what the big important things are that you see in learning today. How's that sound? Chris, you want to start?
Do I go in the same order? Okay.
Yeah.
So again, I'm Christopher Lind. I have kind of a split responsibility right now. So my day job, I guess, as you would put it, is I run digital learning for GE Healthcare. Doing a lot of different unique things over there. Some is not as cool and innovative as some of the newest technology, but sometimes it's about laying the foundations of what you need to get there. So doing a fair amount of that stuff on a day-to-day basis, but then also do a lot of work. I host a weekly live stream and do a lot of other things to just try and help raise the bar with our industry on what technology's out there, what people are doing with things, how to understand it. So yeah, I mean, we'll talk no shortage about the types of cool stuff that's happening in the industry in today's conversation. So I don't want to spoil it.
Thank you. And Diana just joined us. So real quick, I'm going to introduce Diana. Well, welcome, Diana. Diana is a technologist, learning leader. I'm so sorry. One second.
Sorry to pop in. Tech problem is classic for L&D, doesn't it?
You made it in, and that is what matters.
Just to do the real quick intro of Diana, she's a strategist and a storyteller focused on how tech, globalization, and demographics impact work. And she's the author of Future Proof, Reinventing Work in the Age of Acceleration. So welcome. And I was thanking everyone for their time and sharing their expertise. And to get started, we're just going to go around and talk about what you're doing in the space right now. And maybe we can focus on, what the big important themes are that you see in learning today. So Christopher was mentioning what he's doing.
Absolutely. I have been on. I've just been lurking, I guess. So,
okay.
Sorry.
4 o'clock in the morning there.
Wasn't appearing.
You didn't miss anything. That's the best part. You're all caught up.
Yeah.
I thought you did well so far, Chris.
And, so what time is it? What time is it there?
4 o'clock in the morning.
Oh,
Yeah.
it is? Sorry.
In Hong Kong.
Oh,
But
okay.
that's okay.
So let's see if we can, I'll go on to Trish now to talk about what you're doing right now.
Oh, geez, a lot, actually. So, but the short answer is actually focusing on learning engineering. So how do we take a multidisciplinary approach to learning from an engineering kind of standpoint? What's interesting to me about all of that is we're starting to see learning as a capability coming out of our traditional systems and associations and academic institutions and moving into other types of entities. Like IEEE has started the Learning Engineering Consortium, because learning capability and developing learning capability for organizations and people is so critically important. So there's this whole migration, if you will, of learning into these other areas. in order to be able to bring that capability forward. So that's where a lot of my focus is.
Thank you. That's a whole different angle in itself, right? And the next one, Anila, would you like to talk about what you're doing and what you see are the big themes right now?
Yeah, absolutely. So our organization is quite complex. We're in many countries, so there's the ability to get training out there really quickly to thousands of different people in 10 plus different countries working on hundreds of different softwares. So it's really about how can we get training in the hands of people and give them the tools and resources to create and cultivate their own learning cultures, rather than it just being a corporate function held there in a glass jar where only certain people get access to it. It's really about how can we accelerate everybody having access to learning at their fingertips whenever they're ready, while still having the backbone of foundational learning programs and practices that are repeatable and scalable throughout our changing environment.
So we talked about that previously. It was this, I think it was Diana, just in case or just in time learning for folks. And now thank you for that. And Diana, if you could explain what you're working on and how what you see in the learning environment.
I am in Hong Kong, so part of what I see in the learning environment at the moment is, and our panel is about the age of acceleration. Our companies that are trying to grapple with a really sudden change, everyone working at home for months, including all of your children at home, trying to go to school while you work. In small spaces, and people really wondering how they can use that time. So that's sort of the immediate issue. And the amazing thing is that there have been so many things launched just in this crucible of an epidemic. So it's been amazing to see how people can rise to the challenge without the strategic, sort of long runway of, what if we had 3 years, and what do we, and actually that's usually where I come from, is the big strategy, what do we think is going to happen in 2030? How can we prepare for it? How can we be enabled by technology? So it's an interesting view on what can happen when necessity breeds invention.
That's interesting that you just said that, because this is going to be a learning experience for everybody, I think, even like high schools, even beyond the workplace, online learning. I just right before this call, I got a note from the principal of the high school saying we're going to have a real quick seminar on how to do online learning so that we're prepared. So I guess workplaces are going to get in line with this really quickly, especially workplaces that maybe aren't accepting of telecommuting and things like that. So it's the rapidness of it, the having to ramp up right away. So that's the rapid change and the volatility that we were talking about. So where do you start if you have to do that?
I mean, I'll jump in on some of this stuff. I mean, if you want to talk about the disruption this stuff is causing, I think sometimes this is where the whole future of work, future of learning sometimes gets ahead of itself. And, sometimes the simplest innovations are some of the most impactful that I'm seeing. And we're going through it right now when it comes to, some of the basics of just how do you do things in a digital world. A lot of people are struggling with even just the foundations of, how do you connect? How do you collaborate when you can't? We just had a big conference that got moved, and we now are having to rethink how do we launch products in a world where we're not at a conference, and things like that. And so some of those foundational skills to me are some of the simplest ones, yet they're the most critical. And so we can talk about some of these really futuristic technologies, but I would say the readiness of a lot of organizations, from even just the mindset of, we can do things differently, is still lacking in many areas.
Well, and that's one of the big things, again, from an engineering standpoint. I mean, if we look at learning through an engineer's lens, and I'm sitting here at Emerson, so talk about engineering. It's about failure. It's looking at risk and it's looking at points of failure. And how do we mitigate against that risk or avoid risk entirely? And we in learning for a long time, as many of you or many of us have already talked about on the panel, we've had this kind of like long runway, like what are we doing over the next 3 years or what are we doing over the next 10 years? And it's suddenly like, no, conditions have changed. We need to respond right now. And there's a vulnerability in that we in L&D are often we're not used to. We're used to taking some time up front in order to create a right solution that's going to have the upfront investment put into it and going to last for a period of time. And now we're talking about something that could fail. So I'm going through that experience right now. What brought me to St. Louis initially was to actually keynote a conference for another client here and their L&D innovation folks. And we had a go, no go phone call on Sunday within 48 hours of the launch of that particular event to decide if the event was going to go forward, because they had decided that they were going to cancel internal travel. And instead of bringing everybody in from nationwide and co-locating everybody here in St. Louis, they decided that they were bringing the two of us that were coming in order to do keynotes over the 2 days, that we would come in and be the only ones doing the presentations in front of an in-person audience. And everybody else who was facilitating internally would do that online via Skype. And although we've had these technologies for a long time, even in the Western world, even here in the United States, for many people, and I would say probably most, we still haven't had that experience, right? We haven't had that experience of necessarily participating in this kind of capacity. And many people in the L&D function in the Western world and around the world haven't had that experience of doing this, of being able to facilitate online. And people had to make a choice, and good on them, on could they take the activities that they had that were meant to be done in person and actually translate those into a virtual environment within a 24-hour period. And for those who opted out because it just isn't a one-on-one translation, totally get it. And then for those who did try it, again, there's that vulnerability of being willing to experiment and potentially fail and then try again. How do we iterate and move forward? And that's an entirely new mental model and paradigm shift for many of us in L&D.
I mean, if you think about the whole design, I was just going to say, to Trisha's point on that, right? You even look at like the foundations of instructional design, and it was like, ADDIE, and it was this very slow, drawn out process that we went through. And the first step is that mindset. The motto that I have here is we have to get away from accepting failure to expecting failure, and we just have to get really comfortable with that. We just have to be like, things are going to fail, and that is something we plan for, and be okay with that.
And that's part of a culture where it's okay to do that. But when Trish just mentioned it, all I could think of was people that aren't familiar with this are going to want, give me a procedure for how to do this, or give me the framework. How is this supposed to work, so that I can do it in 24 hours, as opposed to let me just go running down the road and make this thing happen. So, which is a little bit different thinking. So that kind of thing is, I think, sometimes dependent on the culture. And in regard to that, let me ask you about the whole concept of a learning organization and how that's important when it comes to organizational learning and having people make learning part of their job, and the fact that we're in a culture that allows us to take risks and allows us to make mistakes, and we're accepting of that because it's part of learning. Can you guys speak to that? How about Anila? You want to try it?
Yeah. So within Harris, we have part of our core values is understanding, learning, and communicate, share knowledge. So built into our foundation is the acceptance and expectation that we're going to do some things that aren't going to work out, but we're going to learn from them, and we're going to be curious, and we're going to say, how can we pivot better or quicker next time, so we figure out it was a problem sooner. So experimentation is part of our DNA. And when experimentation is part of your DNA, you start to learn, how can we experiment in a laboratory environment so we have pivot points if things really go awry, but that we are going to fail. We are going to make mistakes. We just don't want to make that same mistake twice. So like Christopher said, learning is part of that organization, that it's part of the way we do business, not something that's separate, a different department or a different function. It's just how we discuss new information. It's how we collaborate, and we're continuously in that learning environment. It's if we think of work as a lab and we're always in the lab, we're always able to experiment. And failure is part of that. So I think it just has to be part of the acceptance in your organization that you're not going to get fired if you make a mistake, but you learn from that and you share that learning and you make sure that other people don't make that same mistake.
So how do you, I'm so curious because I work with a lot of organizations, how do you share that learning? Because some of them will, you know, always have your telephone for manufacturing companies, always have your phone, and, you know, that have somebody take a picture of the guy who's the master mechanic, and they're actually uploading it, and it's completely, you know, unproduced, but super useful because there's a guy who's been doing it 30 years. And so how do you put that kind of backbone or that flexibility in?
So we're really decentralized. We own 50 plus software companies, and each one gets to determine what's that technology for them. So some use Slack, some use Workplace, some whatever technology fits that core culture. We believe they should be using what makes sense for them. And each one does it a little bit differently. It's not that at corporate we say you have to use this tool and you have to upload it this way. And that allows those groups to really be at the ground level and having those interactions. So there's different tools in each of our businesses, but it's really about that continuous loop, whether it's Teams or Yammer. Each one can really define what the technology is, but that culture of continuous sharing permeates what kind of technology we use.
Mm-hmm.
I was wondering how this works globally, because sometimes I read that, and Mike, John just mentioned this, a little bit in line with this. The fact that traditional companies, they struggle to move toward this way of working and learning. And I'm thinking about this in terms of cultures. So globally, when you try to do this globally, it might be something that's, you know, coming to the table with your mistakes and talking about them might not be comfortable in some cultures. How do you do that in learning? How do you get that across that it's an okay thing to do?
I'll jump in on a couple initiatives that have worked really well on this. And honestly, it comes from modeling it from our organization, but also from leadership. Some of the most successful kind of catalysts that we've injected into the organization that has created a culture more acceptable of failure is where one of them, again, it wasn't even like this mind-blowing innovation, but we had a kickoff where it was all focused on failure. And the way we kicked it off was one of the most senior leaders talked about one of his greatest failures in the organization and the consequences it led and all of this stuff. And then what he learned from it and what the team learned from it and how it moved it forward. And it was amazing watching an organization that culturally had not accepted failure before start to turn the tide, because it was, well, if that's acceptable at that level, right, then we can talk about it more. But I think some of it too that helped with it was we broke learning out of our vernacular and focus more on the behaviors of what we mean when we say we want to build a learning culture. So we focused more on, you know, critical thinking, experimentation, things like that are actual behaviors that we could drive, because when we said learning, we want to learn through failure, it meant a lot of different things to a lot of different people. And we realized that learning was actually causing more confusion than benefit.
That's a really good point. So, you know, changing the language that you use, because it might point to traditional methods and things that people aren't thinking innovatively. So someone also brought up something over here that, Trish, you were talking about how you know that it's not normal, that systems exist in order to preserve the system. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so this is where it gets into, and I think, Diana, you can really jump in on this as well, of course. We've got to be able to keep the bread and butter operations going and then also future-proof in parallel, right? So, and it goes back to like Steve Jobs, like taking Apple and like taking the R&D folks away from core operations, because we need to be able to set those seedlings and grow, if you will, those young plants of R&D, of that research and development, of that innovation piece, and separate it from, again, what are normal forces of an existing system is to preserve that system. So there could be people in core operations inadvertently who wind up sabotaging, if you will, the R&D or innovation, only because they're not that doesn't make them bad, that doesn't make them resistant, that it just is how systems function. And organizations and populations within an organization are systems within a system. I mean, that's all systems theory, and systems thinking is, the way that we impact each other. So if we can run those things in parallel, if we can try and take some of this new stuff and give it a chance to try and fail and learn and iterate, not ongoing forever and ever. We want to fail fast. We want to use small bets, experimentation that takes, low investment, low cost, see what works, see what doesn't, what works. Let's figure out how to, grow it and scale it. But then how do we also protect it from the rest of what's happening with the organization? But the same thing, I think, is also on the reverse side. A lot of the people that are doing the routine work that is necessary for organizations, especially traditional organizations right now that run the existing business model and operating model, they need preservation too. I mean, they're the ones that are still bringing in the revenue. They're the ones that are still driving the business as it stands today. So how do we help people understand, here are some of the folks that we need in order to have on the innovation side, and here are some of the folks that we need that are participating on the day-to-day routine, and how do we make sure that people are successful in those individual roles, and that we do bring them together, that we do so with some intention, and understand that even with the best intentions of human beings and people trying to pull an organization and people forward, that there's a little bit of oil mixing with water there. I mean, wouldn't you say, Diana?
Well, I think you're right. And one of the reasons that I wrote my book, Future Proof, is that I've spent most of my time in that little, innovation hub. And there were a lot of people that were in business as usual, wondering what they should do. So, that it was really about talking to them about a culture of experimentation. And I do think that, yes, that was the way that things are done, and R&D still is like that. But I think it's also changing, because over time we've seen that the innovation without kind of a connection to the larger whole is really, you get this great idea and then you can't really execute it or have it go through the whole organization. I see actually translators, people who, or evangelists or whatever you want to call them, having a role, like having an actual proper role to play in an organization, and even in a sort of job description and a set. And so that idea that everybody has to be innovative is true to a limited extent. And as we go forward, I think that you're seeing that sort of, here's the thing that we're trying to work on, or a project, and here's how we can and kind of put it out throughout the organization. To Anila's point, having something like a learning culture where everybody becomes more agile and more adaptable.
What's interesting about what you're both brought up there, that I've experimented, at least in my org, so I won't talk about the enterprise, but within the learning and talent org, I experimented once with kind of like having an incubator kind of innovation group that was separate. It didn't work. I mean, it worked, but the problem I ran into was that I actually added a whole nother change curve to my own organization, because here on the incubator side, they were way on the other side of the change curve. And then when it actually even came to the rest of the team that was running the day-to-day, they weren't even there. And so we now added this whole timeline to bringing our own internal operations up to speed on what that was. And what I've found, and I think it's a delicate balancing act, I don't think there's a formula for it, but I've found that actually kind of being intentional about what the breakdown is of everybody's role, and saying, listen, yes, 80-90% of your job is the system, but 10% is dedicated to innovation in this specific capacity, so that way it seemed to bridge the gap much better than when I had kind of a separate entity that did all this kind of crazy wild scientist stuff.
that never
It never-
got taken back into the organization.
Right, because we brought it back and everybody's like, yeah, that's cool. We're never going to do that. And then we ended up spending so much time trying to do it because the other thing too was the innovation team had lost connection with reality of what was actually going in. So they're thinking in kind of this pie in the sky versus being connected with the day-to-day. So I think that's where that balancing act of how do we make everybody intentionally kind of part of the innovation versus keeping it a separate entity.
So it's kind of like balancing business as usual with new initiatives and making everybody part of it. So, the whole change thing where people are involved in the change people buy into the change that they're involved in. So making everybody part of the change instead of going off and making the change on the side and then having everybody else then preaching it to them and they won't buy into it because they didn't have a part.
But you have to be cognizant of what Trish brought up, which is the system wants to keep the system where it is. And so you have to be intentional of, I think sometimes in orgs we say, make innovation part of your job. And we just assume people will figure that out and go do it. And they won't. They'll go back to that, space, which is where I think from a leadership standpoint, we have tremendous opportunity to lead and help people understand, this is the part of your work where you need to innovate, or these are the things that you can do to push us forward.
Yeah, thank you for that. So that's that's a really good point. The whole fact that we don't want to just tell people that they need to innovate, but we want to show them how they can innovate. So to me, what you're talking about in a way is these assessment centers maybe, or pilots that you're trying, but integrating that and involving more people. Is that correct?
Yeah. I think that's kind of what I'm getting at in general.
The thing is, sometimes with the business, when you're in big organizations, they want the training that they're used to, or you know what I'm saying. You have that business as usual stuff, and this is what we give, and this is what our day to day is like, and we can't forego that. So it's like, how do we also take that, learn it as, and then integrate that into the business and convince the business. So just to go to the side about a couple of the things that we wanted to bring up today. We talked about the concept of the learning organization, adapting to change, learning from mistakes. What about trends? So, how learning and development is becoming more consultative, personalized, less prescriptive, things like just-in-time learning that someone was talking about. Can one of you guys expand on that, what you're seeing?
I've done a lot of talking, so I'll let somebody else jump in.
Anila, you want to take this one?
Sure, I'll take this one. So we're different than most organizations because we believe in intellectual autonomy. So we put the power at the business unit level. So there might be 25 people in a business unit or 200 people in a business unit, but really the power is at that level. And so for us to be agile, we need to train people within each of those organizations to know how to rapidly deploy content, either internally to train their employees or externally to train their customers. So we've created a structure where our learning management system has very clear best practices, but we train a lot of people on those best practices. So it's not like we have a learning philosophy that we hold tight and only 2 people have access to it. We have ambassadors within each business unit that get the core communication that we send out prior to their business so they can be ambassadors for it. We provide them access to, I think, more tools than a lot of companies do, behind the scenes administrator access, so that they can rapidly deploy. Because if everything waited for us and we had to get it through translation to multiple languages, by the time it actually deployed into the environment, it would be stale content. So it's really empowering people at the point of contact to be able to deploy whatever training is necessary to get their team up to speed. Now, from a soft skills, that's mainly done at the corporate level. So we don't have them certified in change management or EI or any of those. So those are things that we rapidly deploy at a corporate level, and they can push or pull. So leaders can reach out to us and say, we want this content specifically for our group, or they can just sign up for an online virtual training or recorded training at any time that works for them. So multiple mechanisms, I think, is really important. And then we've now started to incorporate Microsoft Teams into our learning so that people can have continuous conversations about that learning and not have to wait for HR or L&D to moderate that throughout the process.
And
So
so,
shared
sorry,
learning?
I'm so curious.
Oh, go ahead.
Go ahead. Shared learning.
Oh, no, go ahead, Diana. I saw you made a
my
good
question
point.
was similar, which is really, so Hire, which is a Chinese company that has decided to split itself similarly into sort of 8-person modules. They're very decentralized, but I'm wondering, as we talked about, as Chris mentioned, and Trish mentioned, how do you then take some of the really interesting things happening down on the ground in a decentralized organization and take whatever learning that might be useful for the rest of the organization and spread that around? How does that work?
So that usually happens more in a structured summit approach. So we take people from all of our different verticals, all of our different product lines, and a couple times a year we get them together in rooms with topics in the middle of the table, just discussing it. Sometimes we have someone from our executive team virtually lead those best practice sessions. Other times those are like we bring physically 500 people together and they get into breakouts and they learn those things. So the day-to-day sharing, honestly, is the one we struggle with the most between those different groups, because one of them might be using like Amazon Web Services. Another is using Java. Another is using Progress. And another one is programming AS400. So some of those learnings, there's no reason to transition them across one group to another.
So on this one, and Trish, I'd love your input on this too, because I think we could talk, right, when you talk about these future trends, I think a lot of the conversations are, VR, AR. I mean, they can kind of go into those big trends, but I think ultimately a lot of what I'm seeing is the democratization of this stuff. And that's kind of getting at what, Anila is talking about, where instead of L&D being the gatekeeper of everything, even though we never really were, we just thought we were. But, instead of being this gatekeeper that everything has to channel through us, we're working through that with others and empowering and doing that. I think the part that we're struggling with is letting go of that control. And again, it goes back to that comfort with risk of being okay with, empowering others and understanding what our role is and that our identity is not disappearing. It's not that we're no longer important. It's just the role we play is very different. And I think that's where, Trish, you would probably jump in on this from a data and analytics standpoint. Our role is becoming more strategic in helping, knowing where we can help and where to lean in and how to do it in the right ways, instead of necessarily always being the tacticians behind it. Because the reality is we don't know what's best. Our people out there do.
Well, here's so my background is actually I came into learning and performance through the IT function and through technology rather than through HR. And so I often see what's happening in global L&D as on a similar trajectory as the maturity of the IT profession, right? Like we're going through a lot of the same milestones. We're just doing it 20 years behind actually the IT function, even though we're sort of an older kind of function, if you will. And most of my work is actually in the emerging markets. It's outside of North America entirely, which is an entirely different dynamic than what's happening in the Western world. And, like here in the Western world, we'll talk about LMSs and we'll talk about e-learning. That's not happening in most of the rest of the world, especially in the emerging markets. They're not using those types of technologies. They have leapfrogged past all of that. So I think that's part of it for us here. And I mean, for those of us that are here in a Western world kind of capacity, and that is we're trying to get past a past. We're trying to transition. And there are many organizations and many learning teams that are not. They're already ahead of the game because they're not going to have to go through the same technologies that for us have now become legacy technologies and so on and so forth. And that includes data. And so one of the things that I'm seeing is, as an example, we often in L&D, in some areas of L&D, talk about how we get treated by the business as order takers. like, you know, they need sales enablement or there's communication training or whatever, and somebody picks up the phone and says, hey, training team, can you come deliver this? And part of the role that I'm doing right now is actually helping organizations provide tools like Tableau and Power BI to the front line. I mean, to people in warehouses, to people on the factory floor. Like, we're building analytical capability in, you know, employees and workers that are working at the front line so that they can make decisions in that moment of need, at the pace of business, at the point of work, you know, instead of the command and control structure and the old bureaucratic model. And that's where the organizational agility is coming in. So bringing all of that together for a moment to say, okay, well, if I'm somebody on the floor, I'm a manager who's running a manufacturing team, I'm no longer guessing anymore what's going on with operations or how to improve my KPIs. We're looking at it on a dynamic dashboard that's being updated automagically through Tableau or through Power BI. We understand what the human performance challenges are that are actually contributing to helping or hindering the organizational result. So we're not making those managers aren't calling the training department anymore, mistakenly asking for the silver bullet of training to come and, you know, train people. We can see what other performance interventions, although of course the business wouldn't call it that, but they can see what other interventions are necessary. And so my thing to learning teams everywhere around the world is, what happens when they stop treating us like order takers? What happens when the business is empowered by analytical output and insights based on the data that they're pulling from operational data, again, live in real time? What happens when they stop calling us for those training opportunities that we've known for a long time are really misguided? And so all of these trends or technologies or data and analytics, building analytical capability within the L&D function, is how do we create the same kind of responsive feedback loops in our own practice to be able to keep up, step up, and actually help in some cases to set the pace to help the business move organizations forward in this regard. And the last piece in all of this is there's so much more that's happening outside of L&D. And with organizations right now, we're in the largest IT migration ever in the history of, you know, humankind and its relationship with technology as we shift from information processing to cognitive computing. We're creating intelligent organizations. We're creating intelligent societies that are ran by analytics and on data. And we're not at the beginning of the cycle. We're towards the upper end and the more maturity of the cycle where the tipping points are coming like really faster. So there's a level of urgency here in us understanding how much of the external organization is changing and where we need to be and how we need to reposition ourselves in that value chain in order to stay relevant to the organizations and the people whom we serve. Now that was a mouthful. I'm going to turn it back over to somebody here, but what do you think? I mean, Anila, is that what you're seeing? I mean, was Harris ever a bureaucratic model, or was it always kind of an agile organization? Or
I think we were set up because of our acquisition methodology. We've acquired over 120 companies in the last decade. So when you're acquiring that quickly, you can't be terribly bureaucratic. You have to be pretty quick to the point and empower people. Like you said, if I'm standing in front of the customer, I have to be empowered with the tools and the knowledge to answer that question, change a contract, whatever I can, and know what my boundaries are to be able to do that. What is within my power, what is not. So I think we had to be that way just by the nature of our business.
And the last piece on there is, I don't think people realize that bureaucratic model is an actual org design. Like that, we deliberately designed organizations for more than 100 years to be bureaucratic, where there was information at the top and it was very few people, you know, the executives, and they got to make the decisions and then it trickled down. And that design, for most intents and purposes now, is over.
One of the things that I was interested in what you said was this whole learning across the globe and how they're blowing past LMSs and e-learning. And is it because of the labor shortages and the fact that they have to push the responsibility down much quicker? There's these economies that have a younger workforce, and they can't hold the responsibility at the top any longer, and they have to push the responsibility down quicker. Is that the reason for, they can't even spend the time to create these structures? Everyone just has to learn immediately?
It's a good question, Carolyn. Of course, like any other performance equation, there's multiple root causes, right? I mean, there are multiple factors that are at play, but what's happening, like South Africa is a really good example. So one of my clients there is MTN, which is one of the largest telecommunication companies on the continent of Africa. Well, the continent of Africa didn't have mobile, cell phone technology until the mid 1990s. And so when they came in with cell phone technology, with mobile technology, they didn't go through the stuff that we experienced in the 1980s with the car and the brick phone and the whole 9 yards. They just went to, straight to the latest and the greatest. And so the same thing is happening, like when I'm in Dubai or when I'm in Kuala Lumpur. Like these are almost, cities and countries that almost overnight became, deliberately so, by the way, on the global stage to compete for talent and resources and tourism. And in so doing, in organizing organizational learning in many of their companies, they skipped all the old L&D models. They didn't get ADDIE from, World War II in the 1940s. They went straight to, by then Michael Allen and those guys were doing, leaving ADDIE for SAM. So they bypassed a lot of the things that we see as sort of, canon, that's like, that they've become legacy for us because we as a society and in an organizational culture and business and management practices have come up this way, and that's not their entry point. They've entered in at a different juncture where there were other possibilities already available, and they've just gone ahead and adopted those without any of the friction or the pain that we're going through, because that's just never been their experience. They don't have the pain of getting past a past.
But I think it's about the need for speed too. It's not just, the question is, why do we not have as bureaucracy as much, or why are we moving? And it is true. Everything is tech enabled. I think that because we can speak to people and are much more informal. But it's also that organizations need to be so much more nimble to compete globally.
Yeah.
And to really learn perpetually.
What I was going to say is one of the things that, being the HR learning leader that's never been in HR, that I can say just from my background is this isn't new. I think what's happening is the data and the technology is allowing us to have greater visibility into what's actually happening in the organization, because the speed and agility that was happening in learning, it was happening before, 2020. It was happening differently. It just was under the radar, and it maybe wasn't necessarily pegged as, oh, this is a learning and development initiative or a learning and development solution, because that's not the way it worked. The business just said this is what had to happen, and they didn't have the resources. They didn't go to HR and say, hey, just as a heads up, we need to do this and that. Can you help us? They just said, we have a problem. We're going to solve it. And we just do it. We just didn't have visibility into it. And now with technology, we have greater visibility into it. And I think there's greater connectedness. So we have to have these enterprise solutions that's better enabling what was already happening. It's just more connected than it was.
Well, and there's a greater trajectory in all of this, to your point, Christopher, and that is, if we go back and look at, it was Peter Drucker who actually coined the term knowledge economy back in 1969. I was born in 1969, and going to high school like in the 1980s, I don't remember hearing the words knowledge economy until sometime into the 1990s. A lot of times we quote Alvin Toffler, and the 21st century illiterate will be those who can't learn, unlearn, and relearn. And that was from Future Proof, well, of course, now
Future
the name slips. Future, thank you. And that was published in 1970. So we've actually had people with management practice and with technology that have seen this trajectory for decades and this a long time coming. And in my presentations, one of the models that I use is Peter Diamandis's 60s of an exponential framework. And it goes from, first something gets digitized, that the second stage is deceptive. So once something becomes digitized, it seems like it's not, taking off, like it's really kind of slow. Then it goes from being deceptive. It goes into, I may be getting the 6 wrong because I don't have my slide in front of me, but it goes on and on where now you start to dematerialize. And what to me is happening right now is dematerialization and ultimately democratization. What you were talking about before, Christopher, is the same thing that happened with our mobile phones, right? So it used to be with mobile phones that we used to have internet was something that we did separately. Phone calls was something that we did separately. We had a different device for music. We had cameras, we had video cameras, and all of those things have now primarily dematerialized into the phone. And when I start to look at things like platforms like, Microsoft Office 365 and its capabilities on performance consulting, and I mean performance consulting, where it's actually, the algorithms are actually analyzing performance issues in a workforce as they work, while they work in the place that they're working on the Office 365 platform, and then providing training and non-training interventions in order to help people improve their performance. Like, there are aspects that for a long period of time over this long trajectory of decades, and in my case, for as long as I've been alive, this has actually been in the works. We've just been going through these different stages. And there's still definitely viability for us and value that L&D can provide if we recognize the things that we need to give up, because it has changed. The economics of all of this has changed, and we again, there's a level of urgency here.
Well, and if we keep, right, the point, this goes back to the connectedness of it, right? It's the technology is only speeding and accelerating this. So this has been in the works for a long time, but now it's moving at a speed much faster than it was. And if we death grip on to the way it's always been, that's where we're in trouble, versus embracing the fact this is where it's going. Our role's changing. It doesn't make us less valuable, but it does change the activities we do and the way we show our value.
Oh no, it makes us less valuable. L&D as it is today is not. No,
as it is today. I completely agree.
It's not sustainable.
No, it's not.
It's Fosway report and any global report that we take a look at, and there's only 4% of L&D that report even having any kind of alignment to anything that matters to the organization. Like, and turnarounds take time.
They do.
Like, the minute that tipping point happens and you find that pink slip and you're out of the workforce, which is what's happening right now with a lot of L&D teams around the world at some big brand organizations, by the time you get that pink slip and you're out of the workforce, you don't have the skills to get back in again.
So let me
drop the mic, Trish, and the panel right there. Thanks, everybody. Have a great rest of your week.
Can I take like a kind of left turn or whatever? So we talk about all this quick learning and the fact that everybody needs to be ramped up quickly, and departments have to be agile, and L&D has to adapt to this or get in the front of this. What about knowledge management? So now everybody's learned. What are you seeing in knowledge management that's little forward thinking in organizations, capturing the, really the people that are really key and their knowledge and what's valuable to the strategy of the organization? What are you seeing in that regard? Who wants to take this one?
Fine, I'll jump in on it. Right. I think from a separation of things, it's becoming, again, I would go back to, from a knowledge management standpoint, this is where at least a lot of the effort that I'm working on right now is how do we actually make it easier for people? Because that's the part that has been very difficult historically, that I know I've struggled with organizations in the past, is like, how do you actually bring that out of people? Because intentionally they don't do it. People just, they get focused on what they're doing. And so how do you be intentional about saying, we need to extract some of this and make it something that is part of your job, versus something that, you do because you want to, because the reality is nobody wants to. And I think that's where, from a knowledge management standpoint, we're looking at things like technologies that are just part of the work, and how do we capture that information in a meaningful way and bring it into the systems that people are using, versus trying to do the traditional L&D model of, oh, we're going to go interview SMEs and we're going to capture, this information, and we're going to have them put together PowerPoints, because then it's just layering on work on top of what they already are doing, and it's not sustainable. So I think that's one of the biggest challenges that I face in trying to tackle this is, how do we use the systems we have to capture knowledge, as Trish was talking about, in things like Office 365? How are we actually using that and making it more available to other people, instead of trying to jam pack it into our old way of doing it? We're like, okay, there's knowledge over here, let's cram it into our LMS and hope people go find it in there. Well, that's not the way it works.
So keeping it, what's in it for me, for people to deposit, right? And then keeping it current, right? It's not just a one-time initiative where you do it and you walk away and then it's stale. How do you make it has anybody ever seen this happen successfully?
The old way?
No, the interactive way, like, capturing it in a system and having people understand. Oh, you had? Can you talk about that?
I mean,
I think we're getting better at it. Go ahead, Diana.
Well, I think that part of it, first of all, I think that things are much more fluid, and that you see people not going inside necessarily for the knowledge, because there's so much of it out there. You don't really always need to do that. And so it can be outsourced or whatever. But then also it becomes your competitive advantage if you can capture learning within the organization. And we become and have to become technologists, where if something interesting is happening, if the elevator mechanic, finds a way to do something that's great, then we have to figure out a way to upload that to a system and tag it and make it available and discoverable at just the right time. I mean, and that becomes a whole nother thing that you have to do as an L&D person, is facilitating the learning across the organization, facilitating the discoverability in the same way that you would if you were, an independent person trying to put your things out there and optimize it so that other people can find it.
It sounds like forensics. It just sounds so hard to do in organizations. I feel like the concept sounds really good, but it almost sounds like something that's insurmountable. And identifying what the important stuff is and capturing it and having people realize that, this is a really good thing to do, and this is part of my job, and, that kind of thing. Do you have anything to say about it, Anila? Maybe what you've done in your organization?
I was saying that there's a challenge on the other side of it becoming a Wikipedia kind of situation. So when you do curate knowledge from everybody, how do you know it's the right knowledge, and who's monitoring all of that Office 365 new data that comes in? So I think using your new hires and the mentor that's mentoring that new hire is some of the best ways to create that documentation. If you're new, you're absorbing all the information that's coming to you, probably from one of the best experts in the organization. So having somebody who's being onboarded be the curator of that knowledge, have the person mentoring them be the double check on that knowledge, so that everything is getting another eye. But you run that risk. The more you disperse the control within the organization, the more you get fake data, fake news sometimes.
The thing with it, though, that I found is the organization, at least when I've done this, is almost better at policing it than any formal channels in play. And I think this goes back to having more of a risk comfort level, being like, you know what? Okay, some of this stuff is not do or die stuff for our organization. So what if somebody puts something out there that's not 100% accurate? Let the community chime in, because a lot of times it goes back to that failure through learning. I've seen things in our social knowledge management where somebody said something completely wrong, and it was a learning opportunity. Everybody jumped in and said, well, hang on a second. Actually, it's this. You need to talk to this person. And actually everybody learned from it instead of kind of the traditional, here's what's great, and this is the gold standard of information, it actually became a learn through failure opportunity, which seemed more sustainable.
Well,
So
a lot
the
of the
Wiki-
stuff we learned before, that was the gold standard, turned out maybe not to be true or relevant. Fast forward a couple decades.
Tarnished.
So
Yeah, it was our gold standard, but it wasn't the organization's gold standard.
No.
But the Wikipedia
And we're-
nature of it sounds agile, where people can go up and fix it, make it current, that kind of thing. Trish, were you going to say something?
Yeah, there was so one of the big Microsoft conferences towards the end of last year featured Dr. David Kellerman, who actually works for an engineering university based out of Australia in Sydney. And as a matter of fact, I'll be meeting with Dr. Kellerman when I'm in Sydney in a couple of weeks. But he actually turned Microsoft Teams into anticipatory content. So what that means is, so he's got, so picture straight up academia, and he has students that are contributing different types of media that are then available throughout the Microsoft Office 365. And then a lot of the conversation and discussion and class discussion and connection is happening through Microsoft Teams. He was able to develop, and this is not his background, he was able to develop fairly quickly a couple of algorithms that are now actually anticipating based on different points of data. So it could be assessments, it could be people's actions and behaviors across the Microsoft platform. But he actually now has it set up where Microsoft Teams is actually creating optimized, relevant, personalized, specific study packs for each individual student on the fly automagically, that it automatically then emails to each individual student. So it goes, oh, hey, Christopher needs this and Anila needs that. And it actually pulls the content together from these different content sources using artificial intelligence and data, and then compiles the actual PDF file and then sends it to that individual. And that's not unique. We're starting to see that from a knowledge management and from an instructional standpoint, where we've got the capabilities in these platforms and systems, especially in those that have unified data sets. Again, hello, Microsoft, the kingdom, across that entire enterprise, of being able to come up with those types of insights where it's even automating that process.
Well, and we need, as long as there's a feedback loop, we actually,
Yeah.
the algorithms need that. They need to make mistakes so it can learn from, okay, I
Sure.
recommended this, that wasn't right. Okay, I can improve my recommendations.
But that's
And how many humans are operating on feedback loops?
Right.
not enough.
Not enough.
Right.
No, that sounds definitely like something that's, the future of learning is personalized, optimized, and probably getting better all the time. I've learned
And here,
in this panel, and I thank you guys for all of the expertise that you've shared and the ideas and what's happening. Does anybody else have anything that we didn't touch on that you might want to talk about or let folks know about? Okay, well, as a non-learning professional, I can't even tell you how much I've gotten out of this panel. So I know there's probably tons of people that are tuned in right now that have gotten a lot of value out of this panel. I took a bunch of notes. I'm going to look some things up. First time I've ever heard the word automagically. I love it. So really, thank you guys. I really appreciate it. It was great to meet you, and thanks for sharing. And have a good rest of the day.
Yeah.
Thanks,
Carolyn, thanks for moderating.
Yeah, thanks for moderating.
Carolyn.
Thanks, everybody, for
Carolyn.
showing up, especially
Nice to meet
foreign
you. Everybody.
morning. Diana, you're crazy. I don't know that I
Go
would
back
have
to
done
bed.
it for
Yeah.
I thought
yeah,
you'd
there
be
you
in
go.
the
Yeah,
US.
go back to bed.
On camera. That's
Yeah, on camera
awesome.
for you.
And thanks to everybody participating in the chat as well.
Yeah, no, good
Yeah.
conversation.
Thanks,
Nice
Mike.
to officially meet you
Thank
all
you.
now. All right.